Sometimes a man does something that makes a whole town stop and stare. That day in Crow's Fork, Montana, Caleb Warren chose a wife nobody wanted. 23 women were lined up hoping for a new life. But Eliza Moore, the preacher's daughter, had been passed over so many times she hardly seemed to be there at all. This story is about how a hardened man saw something in a broken woman that no one else did, and how they built a home out of nothing but grit and grace. Stick with us, and if you like their journey, give us a thumbs up and tell us what city you're watching from. It all started in 1873 in a little settlement hunkered down against the mountains, where the wind never let you forget you were temporary. Caleb Warren had been on the trail for 6 long days. All he wanted was flour and salt, not trouble. He had spent 10 years making sure his life was simple. But as he rode into town, he saw it was all decked out for a bride auction. Women brought in from the east to be looked over like cattle. The whole thing turned his stomach, but he knew getting angry wouldn't change a thing. He aimed his horse for the stable, planning to mind his own business. Then he heard the preacher start his sales pitch. "Gentlemen, a fine selection of Christian women ready to build a home with you." Caleb tried to ignore it. He was almost past the crowd when he took one last look. Most of the women were young, trying their best to look hopeful. But off to the side, in the church's shadow, stood a woman who wasn't trying at all. She was older, maybe near 30, in a plain brown dress. Her dark hair was pulled back tight, but what really got Caleb were her hands. They were clasped in front of her, covered in old white burn scars. She wasn't looking at the men. She was staring off at the mountains, with a look on her face that said hope was for other people. Caleb knew that look well. He saw it in his own reflection. "What about that one?" a rancher called out, pointing at the woman in brown. The preacher's smile tightened. "Ah, Miss Moore, she has skills, but—" "Was she married before?" the man cut in. "No, sir." "Then why's she over there like leftovers?" The crowd chuckled. Miss Moore didn't even flinch. The preacher explained she was quiet and had no family, and had been in a kitchen fire years back. "Her disposition," he said, "is rather melancholic." Caleb heard the real message loud and clear. Damaged goods. The rancher lost interest and turned back to the smiling, prettier girls. The crowd moved on, leaving Miss Moore standing alone. Caleb knew he should have kept riding. He should have gotten his supplies and headed back to the mountains where he belonged. Instead, he swung down off his horse. His boots hit the dirt hard. He walked straight through the crowd as the preacher was praising a young blonde girl. "I'll take that one," Caleb said. His voice cut right through the chatter. Every head turned. He pointed to the woman in the shadows. Her, Miss Moore. You could have heard a pin drop. The other women stared. The men looked confused. The preacher just looked annoyed. Miss Moore slowly turned her head and looked right at him. Her eyes were the color of a storm, and they weren't asking for rescue. They were asking a question, plain and simple. The preacher recovered. "Sir, perhaps you'd like to meet the other ladies?" "I've made my choice," Caleb said flatly. "Your name, sir?" the preacher asked. "Caleb Warren. I have a homestead north of here." The preacher looked him over, seeing a rough man who was likely desperate enough to take the woman nobody wanted. "And you can provide for her?" "I'm prepared to pay your fee and be on my way," Caleb said, his jaw tight. The preacher sniffed. "The contribution to the church is $20. It was pure robbery, but Caleb expected it. He counted the coins into the man's hand. "Miss Moore," the preacher called out, "please come here." She walked out of the shadows. Up close, Caleb saw the scars ran up her arms. Her face was all sharp angles and a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. "This man has requested you as his bride," the preacher said, making it sound like an insult. "Do you accept?" She looked Caleb square in the eye for a long moment. Then, in a low, rough voice, she said one word. "Yes." In the dusty town of Crow's Fork, a woman nobody wanted was sold for $20. The preacher pushed a contract forward. "Sign here," he said, making it legal. But the woman, Miss Moore, spoke softly. "I cannot write." The preacher barely hid his surprise before showing her where to make her mark. With hands scarred from some old trouble, she drew a steady X next to Caleb Warren's name. The crowd whispered, some with pity, others with amusement. Just like that, Caleb had a wife, a complete stranger bound to him by an X in a book. He had no idea what to do next. "You have a bag?" he asked. She just nodded. They stood alone while the auction for prettier brides continued behind them, already forgotten. The woman at the boarding house looked at them with suspicious eyes. She handed over Eliza's single worn-out bag. At the trading post, the owner, Sutton, was even worse. He spoke loudly for all to hear. "Heard you got the preacher's leftover," he sneered. "That one is bad luck, Warren. Fire follows her." Caleb slammed a bag of flour on the counter. "I need 2 pounds of coffee," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Sutton's mouth snapped shut and he weighed the coffee in silence. All the while, Eliza stood by the door, clutching her bag, her gaze fixed on nothing. She was a statue, hardened by years of unkind words. Caleb wondered how long it took a person to learn to be that still. He led his horse and a new mule over to her. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I can learn," she answered, honest and direct. "It is a 3-day ride," he told her, helping her onto the mule. She settled onto its back carefully, trying to take up as little space as possible. They left town without a look back. For the first hour, the only sounds were hooves on the trail and wind in the grass. Finally, Caleb spoke. "We will camp soon. My homestead is another day's ride." He stumbled over his words. "It is 160 acres. The cabin is small, but it is solid." He struggled to explain. "The cabin has 2 rooms. You will have your own space." For the first time, she looked right at him. "You do not have to explain, Mr. Warren. I know what this is." Her honesty was sharp. "You needed a woman for your farm. I needed a place to go. It is a simple transaction." He corrected her. "It is Caleb." A moment passed before she answered. "Eliza." They rode on as the sun fell. The land grew rougher and the air turned cold. Caleb noticed Eliza was riding with more confidence. He even saw her lean forward and whisper something to the mule, and the animal seemed to listen. At a creek, Caleb set up camp with practiced ease. Eliza slid down from the mule, looking unsure what to do. "I can cook," she offered, her voice quiet. "I should earn my keep." Caleb looked up from the fire he was building. The new flames alit her face, softening the hard lines. "You have been traveling for 6 weeks," he said. "You are tired. Just sit down, Eliza." She did, perching on a rock like she was waiting for a scolding. He cooked salt pork and made coffee, the simple smells filling the air. He handed her a plate, and she ate with small, careful bites, as if she were afraid to drop it. Caleb finally asked the question he had been holding back. "The preacher said there was a fire." Eliza's hands froze. When she spoke, her voice was empty of feeling. "I was 16, she began. "The preacher's wife was sick, and I was helping them. A lamp spilled. The kitchen burned so fast." She took a breath. "I got their baby out, but I went back for the wife's jewelry box. It was a foolish thing to do. A beam fell." She looked at her scarred hands. "The preacher's wife died from her sickness, not the fire. He kept me on to raise his daughter, calling it Christian charity. But really, he just needed someone who would work for nothing. When her husband took the daughter to Oregon, the preacher decided to bring brides west. He said it was my chance for a fresh start," Eliza said, a flicker of dark humor in her eyes. "I do not think he ever expected anyone to actually pick me." He handed her a warm cup. "Why did you come out here if you knew?" He trailed off, not wanting to say the ugly part. "That I was left over," she said with no hint of shame. "Because in Illinois, my future was being a housemaid until I was too old to be useful. Out here, there was a small chance for something else." "A chance for what?" She held the coffee in her scarred hands. "To belong somewhere. To not be a burden." Caleb looked at her straight on. "That is not foolish." "So why pick me?" she asked. He took a deep breath, knowing he owed her the truth. "Because you look the way I feel. Like you made peace with being alone, since it is easier than hoping." Her eyes, gray like a winter sky, searched his face. "And you figured that made us a good match." "I figured it made us even," he said. "That might be the saddest reason to get married I ever heard." "Maybe," he agreed, "but it is an honest one." A quiet understanding passed between them. After a bit, she went to wash up at the creek. Caleb stared into the fire, wondering what in the world he had just done. He had spent 10 years building a life that needed no one, a life of hard work and solitude. Then he rode into town and tied his future to a woman with tired eyes simply because he recognized her loneliness. When Eliza came back, her hair was in a fresh braid. "I will take the bedroll out here," he told her before she could ask. "That is not necessary," she started. "Eliza," he said, meeting her gaze, "I told you that you would have your own space. I meant it." She gave a small nod and went inside the tent. As he settled down by the fire, he heard her voice, soft from inside. "Caleb, thank you for choosing me." He did not know how to answer that, so he lay awake, listening to the sounds of the night, no longer traveling alone. The next few days on the trail were quiet. Eliza was a fast learner and never complained. She rode with a quiet strength that he had come to expect from her. She did not ask for much, and he did not offer more than directions. On the third day, he stopped his horse on a ridge. "There," he said. Below them, a small, solid cabin sat by a creek, a curl of smoke rising from behind it. Home. The word felt foreign on his tongue. Down in the valley, Eliza took it all in. The cabin he built with his own two hands, the wild land all around it. "It is quiet," she said. A small smile touched her lips for the first time. "It is perfect." Something in Caleb's chest eased up. He busied himself with the horses to hide it. He showed her the inside of the one-room cabin. It was simple, the home of a man who had long forgotten about comfort. She walked around, her fingers tracing the rough wood of the table, the stones of the fireplace he had built. "The loft is for you," Caleb told her. "I will sleep down here." She climbed the ladder, and when she came back down, her face was unreadable. "I will start on supper," he said, cutting her off before she could offer. "Tonight you just rest." She looked like she might argue, but the long journey had worn her down. She just sank into a chair. He cooked a simple meal of beans and salt pork. As they ate, he watched the tightness in her shoulders finally begin to loosen. This part was easy. This was work he understood. Sharing a space was the real challenge. After she washed the dishes, they stood in the quiet room. "This is not a business deal," Caleb said softly. "You are not my hired help." "Then what am I?" The honest question hung in the air between them. "I do not know," he admitted, "but we have time to figure it out." A flicker of something, maybe relief, crossed her face. "Good night, Caleb." As he lay on his rope bed, listening to her steady breathing from the loft above, he knew she was right. They had time. Later that night in his new cabin, Caleb could not sleep. He was used to silence, but now the quiet was filled with the soft sound of another person breathing in the room above. He had spent 10 years completely alone. This should have felt like an invasion. Instead, it felt something like relief. And that, he thought as he finally drifted off, was the most complicated thing of all. He woke to the usual sounds of the creek and the wind. But now there was something new, the sound of Eliza moving around upstairs. He had a wife. The thought was still strange. When he came down, she was already there, her hair braided and her sleeves rolled up, ready for whatever the day would bring. "Get on up," Caleb said, already making coffee. "I told you I would." Eliza looked around the cabin, asking what needed doing. He set the pot over the fire. "Plenty," he said, "but it can wait until you eat." She insisted she was not fragile. He met her gaze. "Did not say you were, but this is not a race. Coffee first." She finally sat down, folding her hands in that quiet way she had. They ate bacon and Johnny cakes as the morning light filled the small cabin. "The garden is a mess," Caleb finally said. "If you want to work on that, I could use the help." Eliza cleaned her plate with the last piece of bread. "Show me the garden." The plot was a square patch of weeds and dead stalks, maybe 20 feet across. A broken-down fence offered little protection. Eliza walked the edge of it, her scarred hands pushing aside old growth to check the soil. She knelt and let the dirt run through her fingers. When she stood up, she had a look of purpose. "This can be good," she said. "The soil is rich. It just needs work." Caleb pointed to the barn. "Tools are in there. Take what you need. I have to check my trap line, but I will be back by dark." She asked how far the traps were. 4, maybe 5 miles up into the high country. She nodded, her mind already on her new project. Caleb saddled his horse and rode out an hour later. Eliza was already on her knees in the dirt, pulling weeds with a steady hand. She never looked up as he passed, completely focused on the task. The trap line was familiar country. 3 of his 6 traps had caught something. He reset the traps and skinned his catch, the work almost like a meditation. Up in the quiet of the forest, a man could think. But today his thoughts kept drifting back to the cabin. He wondered what he would find when he got home. It was almost dark when he rode back. Smoke was coming from the chimney, but something was different. The garden fence was fixed. New rails filled the gaps, tied with rope. The crooked gate was now straight. Inside the fence, the ground was cleared and turned. Eliza stood in the middle of it, working in the fading light, her face flushed from the effort. Caleb led his horse to the barn. When he came out, she was looking at a diagram she had drawn in the dirt. "You have been busy," he called out. She pushed her hair back. "It is a start." He walked to the fence and was amazed at what she had done. It was more than he had managed in 2 years. "Where did you learn to work like this?" "The preacher had a garden," she said simply. "Someone had to tend it. I will need seeds and manure." He knew a place where deer bedded down. "I can get what you need," he paused. "You did not have to do all this today." "Yes, I did," she said. And Caleb understood. She was proving that bringing her here was not a mistake. Inside, she had dinner waiting. The beans he left soaking were now cooked with salt pork and wild onions. It was the best meal he had eaten in months. After they ate, Caleb stopped her from clearing the dishes. "I will do it. You have earned a rest." She met his eyes, her expression as stubborn as his own. "We trade off," he said. "You cooked, so I will clean. Tomorrow we switch." "Fair," she nodded. It became their rhythm. Caleb hunted and worked the trap line. Eliza took over the garden and the home, patching his clothes with stitches you could barely see. Eliza wasn't one for small talk, and Caleb was grateful for the quiet. She moved through his cabin with a purpose, fixing things a person who truly lived in a place would notice. One morning, almost 2 weeks in, Caleb found her staring at the garden. Deer had busted through the flimsy fence overnight, wrecking the new shoots. Her face was a stone mask, but her knuckles were white. "I should have built it stronger," she said, her voice tight. Caleb looked over the mess. "Could have been worse. They only got to a piece of it. We'll build it higher with the timber I've got stacked." "But you need that," she started. "For what?" he cut in. "It's just sitting there. A proper fence is an investment. Keeps out more than just deer." "I can handle it," Eliza insisted, following him toward the ruined patch. Caleb stood up straight and looked her right in the eye. "I know, but it'll go a sight faster with 2 of us, and we'll do it right this time." For a second, her careful expression cracked, showing a flicker of surprise. He wasn't mad about the wasted work. For 3 hard days, they built a new fence, solid and 6 feet high. They worked together without needing words. He would lift a heavy post, and she'd be right there to steady it. On that 3rd afternoon, looking at their handiwork, Caleb said, "That'll hold?" "It's good," Eliza admitted, running a hand over the smooth wood. A tiny smile appeared on her face for just a moment. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not making me feel like a fool over the first fence." "Nothing foolish about it," Caleb said. "You did what you could with what you had." He realized then that he'd enjoyed those 3 hard days more than any he could remember. It was the first time in a long while he hadn't felt alone. That evening, Eliza pulled a piece of cream-colored cotton from her bag. "I thought I might make some curtains," she said, a little hesitant. "This is our cabin," Caleb said, surprising himself. "You do what you think is best." Over the next week, the place started to feel like a real home. Curtains softened the light, and wildflowers appeared in a cup on the table. He never said a word, but he noticed every single change. 3 weeks after she arrived, Caleb rode back from his trap lines to see Eliza frozen in the yard, staring at the woods. "What is it?" he asked, swinging down from his horse. "Someone's out there," she whispered, "in the trees." His hand went straight to his rifle. As he moved toward the forest, a small girl, no older than 8, stepped out into the open. She was dirty, her blonde hair a tangled mess, and she was clutching a bundle wrapped in cloth. Behind him, Caleb heard Eliza gasp. The little girl's eyes were huge in her starved face. "Please," she croaked, "we need help." Then her legs gave out. Caleb caught her just as she fell. The bundle in her arms shifted, and he saw it was a baby, sickly and far too quiet. Eliza was suddenly beside them, gently taking the infant. "Get her inside," she ordered. Caleb carried the girl in while Eliza laid the baby on the table. The little boy was pale, his breathing shallow. "Water," Eliza said, her voice sharp, "and get some broth heating." While Caleb worked, Eliza tended to the baby with a steady hand. The little girl drank water like she'd been lost in the desert, then started sobbing. "My brother?" she cried. "Is he?" "Shush now," Eliza said softly, touching the girl's shoulder. "He's alive. I'm Eliza, and this is Caleb. What's your name?" "Sarah." Bit by bit, the story came out. Her family had been heading north when their campfire spread. Sarah had grabbed her baby brother, Thomas, and run as the wagon burned with her parents inside. She'd been wandering for 2 whole days with no food. Caleb's heart clenched. Without a word, he brought over the warm broth. Eliza carefully fed tiny spoonfuls to the weak infant, bringing a touch of color back to his face. Sarah ate like she was remembering food for the first time, her eyes fixed on Eliza tending to baby Thomas. Eliza met the girl's terrified gaze head on. "He will not die if I have anything to say about it. He just needs food and a warm bed." She looked at Caleb, and he knew the question before she asked. "They have to stay." Caleb saw the girl with shadows in her eyes and the pale baby in his wife's arms. He knew what happened to orphans out here. Nothing good. He gave a sharp nod. "They stay." Relief washed over Eliza's face. That day was a flurry of gentle care. Eliza cleaned them both, wrapping Thomas in an old shirt. By sundown, the baby was breathing easier, and Sarah had eaten 3 times. Caleb stoked the fire until the cabin was hot. He watched Eliza hold the baby through the night, seeing a deep fear in her eyes he had never seen before. She was scared the boy was too small, that he had been through too much. But Thomas survived that night and the next. Slowly, life seeped back into him. On the 4th day, he let out a healthy cry and Sarah broke down, sobbing with relief. "He is going to be all right," Eliza said, her voice thick with exhaustion. Caleb knew she had poured her own soul into saving that child, fighting for him with a fierceness that was more than just duty. While Thomas grew stronger, Sarah started to bloom. The quiet girl began to chatter, following Eliza around the garden. She was still shy around Caleb, but one day he caught her watching him split firewood. "My papa was strong like you," she said in a small voice. "He told me to run with Thomas when the fire started." Caleb put down his axe and knelt. "You did the right thing, little one. You saved your brother. Your papa would be so proud." Without a word, she wrapped her little arms around his neck. Caleb froze for a second, then held her tight while she cried. That evening, as they drank coffee by the fire, he and Eliza looked at the 2 sleeping children. "We have to decide what to do," Caleb said. Eliza stared into the flames. "If we send them to the authorities, they will be split up. She will be sent to work in a house, and he will be sent to a farm. They will lose each other after losing everything else." Her eyes met his, and they burned with a fire he had never seen. "Or they can have a home. They can have us." The idea settled on Caleb, heavy as a winter quilt. 2 children, the end of his quiet life. He pictured Sarah's arms around his neck and Thomas gripping Eliza's finger. The cabin was already louder and messier. It felt more alive. "It will not be easy," he said. "We will have to build on. We will need more food. Folks will talk, saying we are not even properly married." Eliza reached out and took his hand. "Caleb, do you want to send them away?" He thought of the empty silence that would return to the cabin. "No," he said, his voice rough. "I do not. Then we keep them." It was that simple. They asked Sarah the next morning if she wanted to stay. Her eyes went wide. "You mean for good?" Eliza nodded. "The work is hard, but we would be your family." Sarah burst into tears and threw herself into their arms. "Yes," she cried. "I will work hard, I promise." "Yes, please." Caleb felt a lump form in his throat. A couple of days later, Caleb stood outside at dawn, looking at the small cabin. It was not big enough for a family. Eliza came out with Thomas on her hip. "Thinking about the addition?" she asked. Caleb pointed to the snow already on the mountain peaks. "We have maybe 6 weeks before the first big storm. It has to be done by then." "Can you do it?" "I can, if I do not sleep much," he answered, draining his coffee. I will start cutting timber today. The room only needs to be weather tight. Sarah appeared in the doorway. Hey, can I help? Caleb smiled at her determined face. You can help Eliza in the garden. That food is just as important as a new room. But the girl's face fell. Tell you what, Caleb said. In the evenings, you can help me. You can hand me nails. Deal? Her face lit up like the sunrise. Deal. For the next 6 weeks, Caleb worked from dawn until dark. His hands blistered and his back ached. But the new room began to take shape. A small addition stretching 12 feet by 4 feet from the side of the main cabin. The cabin started to feel crowded, so Caleb began building a new room. Eliza and Sarah, meanwhile, worked from dawn till dusk in the garden, canning and preserving every last vegetable for the winter. Thomas, the baby, was thriving. He'd crawl around the yard, a happy distraction for everyone. They had become a family, a real one. One afternoon, while Caleb was framing a window, he heard horses. 3 riders, 2 men and a woman, were heading straight for the cabin. They looked tired but determined. Eliza came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron, her face set. Sarah ran to her side, and a heavy silence fell over the homestead. Eliza was on a ladder by his side when he saw the riders coming. 3 of them. Caleb climbed down, keenly aware of the rifle leaning against the cabin wall. The lead rider was a man in his 50s. Afternoon, he said. Name is Jacob Hendricks. This is my wife Mary and our son Paul. We have a claim about 8 miles south of here. Caleb relaxed a little. They were neighbors, not trouble. Caleb Warren, this is my wife Eliza. Hendricks's eyes moved to the children. Heard you had taken in the McKinnon children. Mary Hendricks spoke up, her voice kind. We knew the McKinnons a little. It was a terrible tragedy. It was, Eliza said quietly. We came to offer help, Hendricks said. If you need anything. We are managing, Caleb said, a little too quickly. Mary got off her horse, looking at Sarah. Hello, sweetheart. I am Mary. I knew your mama. She told me what a good helper you were. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She did? She certainly did, Mary said. She looked at Eliza. May I come in? I brought a few things. After a moment, Eliza stepped back from the door. While the women were inside, the men stood in an awkward silence. Paul, the son, finally spoke. That is quite an addition you are building. Needed the space, Caleb said. Jacob Hendricks looked at the framing. You have got good technique, but you are racing the weather. You could use help. Caleb's pride flared up. I said we are managing. I am sure you are, Hendricks said, but managing is not the same as thriving. We are neighbors. That means something out here. We help each other. It is how we survive. Caleb wanted to refuse. He had spent 10 years not needing anyone. But he looked at the half-finished room in the snowy mountains. I could use the help, he admitted. Good, Hendricks said, getting off his horse. Paul and I can give you 3 days. For 3 days straight, the Hendricks men worked alongside Caleb from sunup to sundown. With that much help, the new room on the cabin shot right up. Jacob showed Caleb old frontier tricks to make the place sturdy enough to stand up to a harsh Montana winter. Inside, Mary was a blessing, teaching Eliza and Sarah how to preserve food and even making clothes for the children from fabric scraps. That last evening, gathered around the table, it felt natural, like they were all old friends. Over a hot meal, Jacob spun tales of the early days, while Mary gently encouraged Sarah to speak about her own folks. They would be mighty proud that you found a home with good people, Mary told Sarah, giving her hand a squeeze. When the Hendricks family left the next morning, little Sarah gave Mary a hug that nearly knocked her over. Jacob gave Caleb a firm handshake. We are neighbors now, he said. You act like it. Do not wait until you are desperate to ask for help. Caleb watched them ride away, feeling a little off kilter. Eliza stood beside him. They are good folks, Caleb. It is okay to accept a helping hand. He looked at this woman who knew him so well. I am just not used to it. She gave a small smile. Me neither. Maybe we can learn together. They finished the addition just as the first big snowstorm of the season rolled in. The cabin was snug and warm, with plenty of food and firewood to last them. That night, with the wind howling outside, Sarah got up the courage to ask a question. "What should I call you all?" she asked in a small voice. "You take care of us like a ma and pa would." Tears filled her eyes. "I do not know what we are." Caleb's heart ached. Eliza knelt down in front of Sarah. "We are your family," she said gently. "That is what we are. You do not have to forget your real parents to love us." Sarah's voice dropped real low. "What if I wanted to call you Ma?" Caleb saw Eliza's face nearly crumble before she firmed it up, fighting to keep her voice even. "That would be an honor, sweetheart." Then Sarah turned to Caleb. "And you?" His throat went tight. "Yeah," he managed. "You can." Sarah threw herself at them both, laughing and crying. Later, by the fire, Eliza finally spoke. "I never thought I'd have this, a real home." Caleb looked at her in the firelight. "You thought you'd always be alone." He turned his cup in his hands. "So did I. Thought I liked it that way." "But you didn't?" she asked. He thought about the quiet years that were just empty. "No," he said. "I just figured I didn't deserve anything different." She looked at him with an understanding that went bone deep. "Because of what you're running from." It wasn't a question. He'd never told her about Ohio, about losing his wife and son, about the guilt that drove him here. But she knew his hurt because she carried her own. "We all run from something, Caleb," she said. "We can let it catch us, or we can build a wall against it." He looked around the cabin. "I think we're building something." 2 days later, a blizzard hit and kept them inside for 3 days straight. The wind howled something awful. They passed the time together in the cabin feeling full and warm. On the third night, young Thomas woke up screaming, scared of the storm's racket. Eliza tried to soothe him, but nothing worked. Caleb took the boy and settled by the fire, humming low in his chest. Soon the baby's cries stopped and he fell asleep, trusting completely. Caleb looked up and saw Eliza and Sarah watching him. "What?" he asked. Liza just smiled. "You're good with him." "It's more than just holding him," she said softly. "You're letting yourself care." He wanted to argue, but with the baby's heart beating against his own, he couldn't. "Yeah," he admitted, "I guess I am." When the storm broke, the world was buried under 4 feet of snow, clean and new. As Caleb dug them out, Sarah came to help. "Pa," she said, and his heart jumped. "When spring gets here, can we make the garden bigger?" He smiled. "That's up to your ma, but I'll build whatever she needs." That night, Eliza laid it out plain. They needed cash money. The timber camp 2 valleys over paid well for hard, dangerous winter work. "How long would you be gone?" she asked, her face tight. 2, maybe 3 weeks at a time. It was a hard thing, but necessary. When Caleb rode out 5 days later, Sarah stood in the doorway, tears rolling down her face. "You better come back," she said. "We need you." The work was just as brutal as he remembered, but after 3 weeks, he had the money. He collected his pay and headed straight for home. Some folks spend their whole lives feeling like an outsider, convinced a real home is for other people. Caleb was one of those men. After 3 brutal weeks of labor, he rode back to a cabin that wasn't his, to a family he wasn't born into, and wondered if he'd just be sent on his way. But before he could even swing his leg over his horse, the door flew open. Little Sarah, in nothing but her stockings, ran right out into the snow and threw herself at him. She just kept saying, "You came back," over and over. In that moment, Caleb knew this was more than just a place to stay. This was a fight against loneliness, and he was finally on the winning side. Later that night, Caleb laid a pile of money on the table. He'd worked himself to the bone for it. Eliza counted it, her hands trembling just a bit. "This is too much," she whispered. "No," Caleb said gently. "I worked for us." That one word, us, hung in the air between them. It was a promise, it was a prayer. And when he looked at her, he realized it was the truest thing he had ever said. The moment she realized she had been feeling the exact same way was a revelation. You did not need words for an understanding that deep. A quiet feeling settled over the little cabin, chasing out the last shadows of loneliness that used to live there. It was something new, something fragile, but it was real. In the days that followed, the air itself felt different. He'd catch himself watching the way the morning sun lit up her hair. And he'd see her watching him too, with a softness in her eyes that made his heart feel full for the first time in a long, long time. But then January came, and it brought a cold so mean it felt personal. The world outside was frozen solid, and they were all trapped in the cabin. The walls started to feel like they were closing in. The children got restless. One afternoon, Sarah stood at the window, nearly in tears. "I'm so bored," she cried. "I hate being stuck inside forever." Caleb knew it was more than just boredom. It was the kind of hopelessness a hard winter can bring, and he had to do something. Caleb pulled Sarah onto his lap and told her about his own first winter in Montana. He'd been holed up in a tiny shack with two other trappers who nearly drove him crazy. The story made her laugh, breaking the gloomy spell. He then handed her a piece of wood and some sandpaper. "Help me finish these toys for Thomas," he said. As they worked, Eliza watched him. Later, she told him quietly, "You're good with her. Most men don't have that kind of patience, especially for a child that is not their own." Caleb looked over at her, his expression serious. "She is not someone else's child anymore, Eliza. She is ours." He told her he'd decided that the day he came back, when he saw the pure fear in Sarah's eyes, that he might leave her too. "She needs to know this is permanent," he said. Eliza's own eyes shined with unshed tears. For the first time, she felt a real sense of peace. All she said was, "I am glad you came back." But he knew she meant she was glad he was home to stay. When a brief thaw came, they all busted out of the cabin like prisoners set free. Eliza noticed that Sarah was always mothering little Thomas, and it worried her, but Caleb saw the truth. He told Eliza, "She is making herself essential. That way, she believes we will never leave her behind." He understood that fear better than anyone. As another storm hit, covering every tree and rock in a sheet of treacherous ice, Caleb looked at his new family. They were fragile, but they were his, and he would face any storm to keep them safe. Caleb was in the barn when he heard Eliza scream. He ran, heart pounding, and burst inside to find her on the floor, holding baby Thomas, her face pale with pain. "I slipped on the ice," she gasped, cradling her left wrist. "I think it's broken." Sarah was frozen with fear. Caleb knelt down, his mind racing but his hands steady. The wrist was already swelling up bad. "It's broken, all right," he said calmly. "Sarah, fetch me a straight piece of kindling and some strips of cloth. We have to set it now." He poured Eliza a cup of whiskey. "Drink all of it." She did, without even wincing at the burn. "This is gonna hurt," he told her softly. "I'm sorry." She just nodded. "Do it." He worked fast, his hands sure from years of hard labor. He felt the bones align and quickly splinted the arm. She never made a sound, but tears streamed down her cheeks. When it was over, he helped her to a chair. He sent Sarah to comfort the crying baby. Kneeling in front of Eliza, he saw not just her pain, but her strength. He knew then that they could handle whatever came their way as long as they had each other. Eliza argued that her hurt wrist was not enough to stop her from working. Caleb finally put his foot down. "No," he said firmly. "I will do it. Sarah and I, we will manage. You have carried this family long enough. Let us carry you for a while." The next 6 weeks were a real test. Eliza hated feeling useless. Caleb took over the cooking, which meant simpler meals. The house was not as neat, but they all adapted. Slowly and not without some fuss, Eliza learned the hard lesson of how to let other people take care of her. One clear evening in late March, Eliza found Caleb outside, just looking up at the stars. "What is on your mind?" she asked. He told her he was thinking about how different his life was now, how he thought he knew his path, and how wrong he had been. "Do you have any regrets?" she asked quietly. "Not a single one," he answered. "Sometimes I just wonder what I ever did to deserve this, you, the children, this life." Eliza stood close beside him. "You chose it," she said. "That day in Crow's Fork, you chose us. Everything else came from that choice. I chose better than I knew." Caleb said softly. "So did I," she replied. She looked him square in the eye, her honesty as clear as the night sky. "I love you, Caleb. I do not know when it started, but it is true." The words settled into a place in his chest he thought would always be empty. "I love you too," he said, and the words felt as natural as breathing. "I think I have for a while. I just did not have a name for it." They held each other, then, two lonely souls who had finally found their way home. The sound of the children inside brought them back. They walked to the cabin hand in hand. Later that night, Caleb did not go to his bedroll by the fire. He climbed the ladder to the loft where Eliza slept. She made room for him without a word. In the quiet dark, he spoke. "We ought to get properly married," he said, "in front of a minister. I want to do it right." She was quiet for a moment, then agreed. "When spring comes," she said, "we will go to Crow's Fork and make it official." "Let them be shocked," Caleb said, holding her tight. "Let them see that sometimes the choices nobody understands turn out to be the best ones." Spring came late that year. The snow finally melted and the first green shoots appeared. Eliza's wrist healed, a little crooked but strong enough. She went back to work with even more energy, expanding the garden. Sarah helped with everything, growing taller and more confident every day. She looked after baby Thomas, who followed her everywhere. The homestead was proof of all their hard work. The new room was finished and lived in. The garden was twice its original size with a strong new fence. Caleb had built a chicken coop, and 6 hens gave them eggs every day. They even got a milk cow from the Hendricks family. They were no longer just surviving. They were building a life. Some folks are just meant to survive, but Caleb and Eliza, they were fixing to do a whole lot more. See, they were the outcasts from the start, a man and a woman thrown together by a town that had no faith in them. But they didn't just build a home, they built a family. It just goes to show that where you start has nothing to do with where you end up. That spring, they decided it was time to ride back to Crow's Fork and make things official. Caleb wanted that preacher to eat his words and see the life they'd made. The night before they left, Caleb couldn't settle his mind. He stood outside under the stars when Eliza joined him. She asked if he was having second thoughts. He just pulled her in close and said he was only thinking about how much they had changed. They weren't strangers anymore. They were everything to each other. They set out at dawn. It was a sight to see. Caleb and Eliza on the horse with little Thomas, and young Sarah leading the mule like she'd been born to it. The journey back to town was quicker this time. The path was clearer, and their hearts were lighter. They looked down on Crow's Fork from the ridge, a place that once held so much fear for them. Caleb looked at his family and knew he could never feel alone again. He finally understood what it meant to be home. Riding down that main street, folks started whispering and pointing. They couldn't believe their eyes. This broken man and his scarred bride, looking happier than any of them. By the time they reached the church, a crowd was brewing. The preacher stepped out, his eyes about to pop out of his head. He looked at them, then at the 2 children. "I see you've been busy," he said with a little smirk. Caleb's voice was steady as stone. "These are our children. We're here to make our marriage proper." The preacher stammered, surprised they'd even come back. "Well," he finally managed, "do you have witnesses?" Caleb wasn't sure who in this town would stand for them. Just then a voice called out, "Will witness." It was Jacob and Mary Hendricks, smiling big as Texas. They'd heard Caleb and Eliza were back and came right over. A few other decent folks stepped up too, even old Sutton from the trading post, though he looked like he'd rather be wrangling snakes. Inside that little church, with the sun shining through the dusty windows, Caleb and Eliza stood tall. Sarah stood right there with them, holding her baby brother. The preacher read the words, but Caleb only had eyes for Eliza. He saw the strength that had gotten her through a life of hardship. When the preacher asked if he would take her as his wife, Caleb's "I do" rang out strong and clear. Eliza's was just as certain. The preacher declared them husband and wife, and Caleb gave her a gentle kiss. In that moment, with their family and a few kind souls watching, everything was finally right. Outside, Sarah hugged them both. "Now we're a real family," she cheered. But then a young woman approached them. She was one of the other mail-order brides from last year, her face tired and her belly swollen. She looked from her own husband, who watched her like a hawk, to the warmth of Caleb's family. She stepped up to Eliza and whispered, "I'm so happy for you." It was a small, sad surprise. In that moment, Eliza saw just how different her life could have been. Eliza squeezed Caleb's hand, a silent thank you for the life they had made. "We were lucky," she said. But Caleb shook his head. "We made our own luck." The next morning, before leaving town for good, Caleb bought supplies. He was investing in their future, in their land. Sutton at the trading post tallied up the goods. As Caleb packed the last of it, Sutton grumbled, "Heard you made it through winter with those kids." Caleb just looked him square in the eye and gave him a slow nod. That was all the answer the man, or the town, would ever need. We did, and we are staying put. Our home is right where it is, Caleb said flatly. Sutton gave a slow nod. Takes a special kind of folk to make a go of it out here. I might have been wrong about you and your wife. It was the closest to an apology Caleb was going to get. On the trail home, Eliza taught Sarah about the land, what you could eat, and where critters made their homes. The girls soaked it all in. You are teaching her to be self-reliant, Caleb remarked. I am teaching her to be capable, Eliza said. Capability is freedom, but being capable and alone is just lonely. Our family, this partnership, that is what gives it all meaning. That night, they camped by the same creek as their first journey together. Back then, they were just two damaged strangers. Now they moved with an easy rhythm, a team. After supper, Sarah asked for a story. Caleb pulled her close. A true one, she said, about when you were a little boy. Caleb thought back to memories he usually kept locked away. He found they did not hurt so much anymore. When I was your age, he started, I lived on a farm in Ohio with my family. We worked hard, but we found time for fun. There was a creek nearby, and us boys would sneak off to swim. We got in trouble every time, but it was worth it. He smiled. Mama would fuss, but she always had towels waiting. She said boys needed a little wildness in them. What happened to them? Sarah asked. My parents passed on. My brothers and I, we just scattered. I let us lose touch, he admitted. I figured being alone was safer than losing someone again. You were wrong, Sarah said. I was wrong, Caleb agreed, looking at Eliza across the fire. Being alone was just being lonely. It took your ma to teach me that. Later by the fire, Eliza thanked him for sharing his story. Sarah still worries we might disappear like her own parents did, Caleb said. How do we show her she is here for good? The same way we showed each other, he answered. We just keep showing up, day in and day out. After a while, she will know it in her bones. Consistency is its own kind of magic. They arrived home the next afternoon. The valley was peaceful and perfect. Sarah ran to check her garden while Thomas crawled for the cabin door with surprising speed. They settled back into the easy rhythm of home. That night, after the children were asleep, Caleb stood with Eliza under the stars. I have been thinking, he said, about claiming the land to the east. Good grazing land, we have got 2 children to provide for, and maybe more someday. He hesitated. That is, if you wanted more, ones that are ours from the start. Eliza took his hand and placed it on her belly. I was going to tell you tonight. I am pregnant, Caleb. About 3 months along. The world stood still. A baby, their baby. One who would never have to know what it felt like to be alone. Are you happy? She asked, searching his face. Happy did not even begin to cover it. Caleb pulled her in close. I am terrified, he admitted, and happier than I ever thought a man could be. That sounds about right, she laughed. They told Sarah the next morning. Her face lit up with pure joy. Will it be a brother or a sister? Can I help? This baby, she said, her eyes shining, will be part of our family from the very start. You are part of our family from the start, too, Caleb told her gently. Blood does not make a family, Sarah. Love does. Choosing each other every single day does. Some folks think a family is something you are born into, but sometimes the best ones are built from scratch out of broken pieces. That is how it was for Caleb and Eliza. They took in 2 orphans, Sarah and little Thomas, and found a purpose they never expected. This story right here shows that even when life deals you a tough hand, you can build something beautiful. You just watch. That spring, Eliza started to show, and with it came a softness that suited her well. Young Sarah, bless her heart, threw herself into getting ready. She sewed tiny clothes and was just full of questions. Even little Thomas, who they nearly lost months before, took his first steps. He would toddle between Caleb and Eliza, squealing with pure joy. It was a miracle, plain and simple. Caleb worked hard, adding more land to their homestead, building a future for this family he was growing to love. Before long, Eliza began teaching Sarah her letters using the family Bible. That girl was a quick study. I tell you what, soon she was the one reading to everyone in the evenings. One night she read a verse about the Lord having plans for hope and a future. Eliza looked over at Caleb and shared a smile. They had found both right there in that little cabin. The summer heat brought the harvest, and they worked from sunup to sundown. Eliza, heavy with child, directed from the porch while Caleb and Sarah brought in bushel after bushel. They knew another little mouth would be at the table come winter, so they put up everything they could. Their baby girl arrived on a cool September morning. Caleb tore out on his horse to fetch Mary Hendress, the nearest neighbor who knew about birthing. He paced that yard like a nervous cat until he heard that first cry. It was a sound that nearly buckled his knees with relief. Mary stood in the doorway, grinning ear to ear. She said, "You have a healthy daughter, and Eliza is a champion." Inside, Eliza looked tired but absolutely radiant, holding a tiny little bundle. She told Caleb to come meet his daughter. The baby had dark hair like her mama and a grip that surprised him. "What should we name her?" Eliza asked. Caleb did not have to think long. He said, "Let us call her Hope." And that is what she was. Hope. When Sarah came in to hold her new sister, her face was just filled with wonder. She whispered to that tiny baby, promising to always protect her and be the best big sister. Caleb had to turn away, a lump the size of Texas in his throat. This was what they had built, a place where hurting people could heal and lost children could belong. The next few months were a blur of sleepless nights and small miracles. Hope was an easy baby, and Sarah was a natural helper. Even Thomas seemed to take to being a middle child with grace. Winter came, but this time they were ready. Their little cabin was warm and their cellar was full. One snowy evening, Sarah looked up from her book and asked a question that hushed the room. She asked if her first parents would be happy about where she ended up. It was a heavy question, full of all the loss that little girl carried. Caleb chose his words with care. He told her they would be grateful she found people who loved her, and that she was safe and growing into a fine young woman. She then asked if they would be sad it was not them raising her. Eliza answered gently, saying that loss is always sad, but she thought they would be at peace knowing Sarah was happy and loved. Sarah nodded, working it all out in her mind. "I miss them," she said softly, "but I love you too. Both things can be true, right?" Caleb assured her they could. "Love is not limited, Sarah," he told her. "You can love the parents you lost and the parents you have now. There is room for all of it." A little while later, after the children were asleep, Eliza told Caleb he had been good with Sarah. He just said he told her the truth, that you can build something new without betraying what you have lost. He finally believed it himself. Spring rolled around again, and with it came more work and more life. One afternoon, a wagon pulled up with a tired-looking family inside. The man asked if they were on the right road to a place called Crow's Fork. Caleb told him they were close, just another day's ride. The man's wife leaned out, her face etched with worry. She said, "We have heard stories about how hard this territory is. We are starting to think we made a mistake coming here." Caleb looked past them, at his own sturdy cabin, at the fields he had cleared, and thought of the family inside. He knew just what to say. Just then, a wagon full of weary travelers pulled up. The family inside looked worn down by the trail. "It is hard," Eliza told the woman coming to stand by Caleb. "The winters are long and the work never ends. But it is a beautiful life. If you are willing to work and build something real, it is worth every bit of hardship." "We are living proof," Eliza said with a smile. They gave the family supplies and sent them on their way with renewed hope. That evening, Caleb watched his family as the sun set over the mountains. He had everything a man could ever ask for right here. Caleb stood with his hands on Eliza's shoulders, looking out at the life they'd carved from this tough Montana land. Eliza leaned back and said, "You know what I was just thinking about? That day back in Crow's Fork. The day you stepped up and chose me, the woman nobody else gave a second glance." She turned to face him, her eyes soft. "You changed my whole world with that one choice. I figured I was only ever gonna get the scraps life threw my way. But you saw something in me I couldn't see myself." Caleb just smiled and kissed her forehead. "Honey, you did all the hard work. I just opened the door." "No," she said, correcting him gently. "We did it together. That's the whole point. Every tough decision, every hard day, we faced it side by side, and that's what made all the difference." From her spot by the fire, their daughter Sarah looked up. Y'all getting sappy again? Caleb chuckled. Maybe just a little. That's okay, Sarah said with a grin. It means you're happy. And they were. It was a deep down happiness, the kind that comes from knowing you finally found your place in the world. Now, life in Montana was never going to be an easy trail. They knew there'd be bitter winters and lean times ahead. But they weren't afraid because they'd face it all together. They had chosen each other not just once, out of desperation, but every single day since. They chose to build something real and lasting out of folks and feelings that other people had tossed aside as worthless. As the first stars began to pop out in the darkening sky, they headed inside. The cabin was warm and bright, filled with the sounds of their children and the smell of supper. It was the feeling of being right where you belong. Caleb shut the door on the cold night and looked at his family. Sarah with her book, Thomas with his wood blocks, and Eliza looking at him with a heart full of hope and trust. He'd spent so much of his life thinking he was better off on his own. But standing there, surrounded by the family he'd built with the woman nobody wanted, Caleb finally understood how wrong he'd been. He wasn't better off alone. He was just alone. And now, after all those years of roaming and keeping to himself, he was finally home. Not just in a cabin, but in a life, in a family. That so-called unwanted bride had become the very heart of his world. Those forgotten children were now his greatest joy. And this hardened old trail man had finally learned the truth. The bravest thing he'd ever done wasn't survive in the wild by himself. It was finding the courage to open his heart and let other folks in. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the pine trees. Inside, the fire crackled and his family settled in for the night. And right there, holding his wife's hand, Caleb Warren knew, clear as day, that this was the life he'd been searching for all along. He just hadn't known it until he found her.